On a quiet road, a routine traffic stop was about to set the stage for an unforgettable confrontation. A black man, calm and composed, pulled over without hesitation, his hands firmly on the wheel. What seemed like an ordinary exchange would soon spiral into an encounter charged with tension, questions, and choices that would carry heavy consequences. The officer approached, his tone sharp and devoid of courtesy. "License and registration," he demanded. The man complied, handing over his ID with steady hands. But as the officer glanced at it, something shifted, a moment of hesitation, then a piercing glare. "This is my town," the officer said coldly, "and people like you don't belong here." The man remained silent, his expression unreadable. The seconds that followed felt like hours, the air between them thick with unspoken challenges. What began as a simple stop was on the verge of becoming something far more significant, something neither man was prepared for. What would push this officer to cross the line, and why did this man seem so composed, so sure of himself? The answers were just out of reach, waiting to unfold. Before we start, let me ask, what would you do if someone judged you by the color of your skin? Today's story will challenge everything you think about justice and power. Subscribe for more impactful stories, like this video to show your support, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Ezekiel Carter was a man who defied the odds. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he was raised to value hard work, integrity, and perseverance. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, and his father, a carpenter with calloused hands and a steady demeanor, instilled in him a belief that success was possible, even in the face of adversity. Ezekiel carried those lessons with him, carving a path that led from humble beginnings to the halls of power and influence. Now a highly respected attorney and advocate for civil rights, Ezekiel's presence was commanding. He wore his success with quiet pride, not flashy or boastful, but unmistakable. On this particular day, Ezekiel was en route to an important business meeting that could open doors to a new opportunity, one that promised to expand his influence in ways he had long dreamed of. Dressed in a tailored suit, briefcase in hand, he exuded confidence. But beneath that exterior lay a man who had seen and endured more than most would ever know. Ezekiel was no stranger to prejudice. Even with his accomplishments, he had faced moments that reminded him of how society often judged him not by his character, but by the color of his skin. He had learned to navigate those challenges with grace and strength, using them as fuel for his relentless pursuit of justice. On the other side of town, Officer Joseph Cooper was starting his shift. A veteran in the police force, Cooper had spent nearly 2 decades patrolling the same streets, enforcing the law with a firm hand. To his colleagues, he was seen as a man who believed in order and control, someone who didn't tolerate disorder in his jurisdiction. But beneath the uniform was a man shaped by his own biases, hardened by years of seeing the world through a narrow lens. Joseph grew up in a small, predominantly white community where diversity was scarce and stereotypes were abundant. His father, a retired officer, often spoke of maintaining respect and authority, values Joseph absorbed and carried into his career. Over time, these ideas evolved into a rigid worldview, one that often blurred the line between enforcing the law and wielding authority as a tool of power. Their paths, though vastly different, were about to collide. Ezekiel, a man who fought to dismantle the very systems of inequality that people like Joseph upheld, had no idea what awaited him just a few miles down the road. Joseph, already predisposed to see anyone who didn't fit his mold as a threat, couldn't have foreseen the implications of the encounter about to unfold. The stage was set for a confrontation neither man had planned for. On one side, a man who stood as a symbol of resilience and justice. On the other, an officer whose authority masked an internal battle with his prejudices. As their lives converged, the question lingered. What happens when 2 men from opposite ends of the spectrum face each other in a moment that will test everything they believe in? It began with something so routine that no one would have thought twice about it. Ezekiel Carter was driving down a quiet stretch of road, focused on his destination. The day had been planned meticulously, and he was on track for a meeting that could open new doors for his advocacy work. His thoughts were on his presentation, the key points he wanted to make, and the goals he aimed to achieve. Then, the flash of blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Ezekiel glanced at his dashboard, his speed well within the limit. He looked to the side mirror, saw the patrol car close behind, and instinctively signaled to pull over. As the car came to a stop, he exhaled deeply, a familiar tension settling in his chest. Officer Joseph Cooper stepped out of his vehicle, his movements deliberate and measured. Approaching Ezekiel's car, Cooper's gaze swept over the vehicle, then landed on the man inside. For a moment, he hesitated. Ezekiel rolled down his window, his face calm, his hands resting on the steering wheel where they could be seen. "License and registration," Cooper said, his voice flat but clipped, giving no room for discussion. Ezekiel nodded, reaching for his wallet and the papers in his glove compartment. As he handed them over, Cooper's eyes lingered on Ezekiel's ID, his expression hardening. "Where are you headed?" Cooper asked, his tone sharper now. "To a meeting," Ezekiel replied evenly. Cooper examined the ID again, tilting it slightly as though inspecting it for flaws. There was a pause before he asked, "What kind of meeting?" Ezekiel's response was straightforward. "A business meeting." But something in Cooper's demeanor shifted. The pause stretched longer this time, his expression tightening. Finally he said, "Business meeting, huh? What kind of business are you in?" Ezekiel's gaze didn't waver as he replied, "I'm an attorney." Cooper's lips pressed into a thin line. He held the ID up, studying it for a moment longer, then looked back at Ezekiel. "Well, I've never seen you around here before." "That's because I don't live here," Ezekiel said, his voice calm but firm. Cooper seemed dissatisfied with the answer. He glanced at the registration papers and then back at the ID. Without a word, he stepped back from the car and walked toward his patrol vehicle. Ezekiel waited, his eyes fixed ahead. He had been through encounters like this before, each time hoping it would be uneventful, each time preparing for it to be otherwise. Minutes passed, and Cooper returned. But this time, his demeanor was different. He leaned down slightly, holding the ID between two fingers. "You know," he said, his voice laced with something Ezekiel couldn't quite place, "I see people like you all the time, thinking they can just roll through here, acting like they belong." Ezekiel didn't respond. His silence seemed to agitate Cooper further. "You think that ID means something? You think it protects you?" Cooper's words hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Then, without warning, he reached for a lighter in his pocket. Before Ezekiel could fully process what was happening, Cooper flicked the lighter, the small flame dancing against the edge of the ID. The plastic began to curl and blacken, the photo and name distorting until it was no longer recognizable. Cooper watched it burn before tossing the remnants to the ground. "Now," he said, his voice cold, "prove who you are." Ezekiel's eyes followed the burnt pieces on the asphalt. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, his mind racing with the implications. He thought about the years it had taken to get that ID, the countless obstacles he had overcome, and the sacrifices his parents had made. That small piece of plastic represented not just his identity, but his entire journey, and now it was gone, destroyed in an act of blatant disrespect and power. But Ezekiel didn't give Cooper the reaction he was looking for. He didn't lash out or retaliate. Instead, he met Cooper's gaze with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. For Ezekiel, this wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices and who didn't have the voice or the platform to fight back. Cooper stood there, waiting for a reaction, but all he got was silence. Silence that carried the weight of resilience, of dignity, of a refusal to be broken. And in that silence, the true battle began. Ezekiel Carter remained composed, Even as Officer Joseph Cooper's actions grew increasingly erratic, the charred remains of his ID lay at his feet, but Ezekiel's calm demeanor seemed to challenge the officer's authority in ways words could not. Taking a steady breath, Ezekiel spoke, his voice firm yet measured. "I know my rights," he said. "What you've just done is not only wrong but illegal." Joseph Cooper's face darkened, his frustration evident. The power he was accustomed to wielding was being met with resistance, not through aggression, but through quiet defiance. He leaned closer, his tone sharp and condescending. "Talking back, are we? You think you're smarter than me because you know a few laws?" Cooper's words dripped with hostility, his stance growing more threatening with each passing moment. Ezekiel didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Cooper, unyielding. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to ensure my rights are respected." Nearby, a bystander had noticed the escalating interaction. A young woman, holding her phone tightly, began recording from a distance. She whispered to the person next to her, "Something's not right about this." The camera captured every word and every action, preserving the moment as it unfolded. Cooper noticed her out of the corner of his eye. His irritation spiked as he turned toward her. "This is none of your business," he barked. But she didn't stop. The lens of her phone stayed fixed on him, a silent witness to what was happening. Ezekiel caught the movement and glanced toward her, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to the officer. The tension thickened as Cooper stepped back and crossed his arms, his voice rising. "You think you can embarrass me? Do you think a camera changes anything? This is my town, and I enforce the rules here." Ezekiel's response was calm but resolute. "The law applies to everyone, officer. You don't get to rewrite it to suit your own biases." This exchange, though spoken in even tones, carried a weight far beyond the scene itself. It was a clash between two opposing worlds, one where authority was wielded without accountability, and another where resilience sought to challenge systemic injustice. The bystander's video was already gaining attention online, shared in real time as viewers began to comment on the scene unfolding before their eyes. Messages like, "This is why we need change," and "He's staying so calm, but the officer's out of control," flooded in. Ezekiel, unaware of the growing audience, stayed focused on the present. As the confrontation continued, the broader implications of this moment became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about Ezekiel and Joseph Cooper. It was a reflection of a larger issue, one deeply rooted in history. For decades, stories like this had played out in towns and cities across the country. Statistics painted a grim picture. Black drivers were disproportionately pulled over, searched, and subjected to force compared to their white counterparts. The numbers weren't just statistics, they were real lives, real stories of people who had faced humiliation, fear, and far too often tragedy. This moment was no different. Ezekiel's composure was not just a display of strength, it was a shield, a way of protecting himself in a situation that could so easily spiral out of control. But for Cooper, it was a challenge to his authority, one he wasn't prepared to handle. The young woman recording stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with concern. "Officer, I saw what you did. Burning his ID? That's not right." Cooper turned sharply toward her, his face flushed with anger. "I told you to stay out of this." She didn't back down. "I'm staying right here. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't go any further." Her courage was a reminder that bystanders have a role to play, and that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to continue. Ezekiel glanced at her again, a silent acknowledgement of her support, a moment where personal dignity met systemic injustice head-on. What would happen next wasn't just about Ezekiel or Cooper. It was about the kind of society we choose to live in, and whether silence would allow injustice to prevail. This is the moment where everything changes. If this story has you hooked, like the video and share it with someone who needs to see it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. What would you do in Ezekiel's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. Ezekiel Carter stood his ground, his calm unshaken despite the blatant injustice he had just experienced. Officer Joseph Cooper's frustration continued to mount, his authority now being challenged by the quiet strength of a man who refused to be intimidated. "Who do you think you are?" Cooper demanded, his voice rising, trying to assert control over a situation that was slipping from his grasp. Ezekiel took a deep breath and looked directly at the officer. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Cooper scoffed, stepping back with a mocking laugh. "Try me. Let's hear what big story you've got." Ezekiel remained silent for a moment, weighing his words. He had spent his life fighting for justice, speaking truth to power, but in this moment he recognized the deeper implications of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about him. It was about exposing a system that allowed moments like this to happen every day. As tension hung in the air, the sound of another vehicle approaching broke the silence. A second patrol car pulled up, and a younger officer stepped out, his expression neutral as he assessed the scene. He walked toward Cooper, his eyes shifting between him, Ezekiel, and the remnants of the burned ID scattered on the ground. "What's going on here?" the second officer asked, his tone even but laced with curiosity. "Routine stop," Cooper replied curtly. "This guy's giving me a hard time." Ezekiel raised an eyebrow, his composure unwavering. The younger officer turned to him, studying his face for a moment. Something about Ezekiel struck him as familiar. He glanced at the ground, noticing the charred ID, and then back at Ezekiel. "Wait a second," the younger officer said, his voice tinged with recognition. "You're Ezekiel Carter, aren't you?" Cooper's demeanor shifted slightly, though he tried to mask his reaction. He turned to his colleague with a skeptical expression. "Who?" The younger officer took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ezekiel Carter, civil rights attorney. He's been all over the news, cases against police misconduct, advocating for reform." Cooper froze, his confident posture faltering. He looked at Ezekiel again, this time with uncertainty. "Is that true?" Cooper asked, his tone less aggressive now, though still laced with disbelief. Ezekiel nodded, his gaze steady. "It is." For a moment, Cooper seemed to be processing what this meant. The weight of the situation began to settle over him. The younger officer's words confirmed what Cooper had likely already suspected but refused to acknowledge. The younger officer turned back to Cooper, his voice firm but controlled. "Do you understand what you've done here? Do you realize who you just disrespected, who you just humiliated?" Cooper didn't respond, his face paling slightly as the reality began to sink in. Ezekiel, standing tall and composed, broke the silence. "You didn't see me as a person," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of undeniable truth. "You saw a stereotype, a threat, something you thought you could control. You didn't see a human being, just a skin color." Cooper shifted uncomfortably, his confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. Ezekiel continued, his words measured but piercing. "Your actions have consequences, officer, and not just for me, but for you, for your department, and for the system you represent." The younger officer nodded slightly, as if to affirm Ezekiel's statement. Cooper, for the first time, seemed unsure of himself, the arrogance that had defined his demeanor moments earlier now replaced by a flicker of regret. Ezekiel's presence in that moment was undeniable. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. The truth he spoke carried enough weight on its own. This was no longer a simple traffic stop. It was a turning point, a moment that would be remembered, not just by those present, but by a larger audience watching and listening. The younger officer glanced at Cooper, his voice firm. "We need to call this in." Cooper nodded reluctantly, his gaze fixed on the ground as he reached for his radio. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of his actions and the fallout that was sure to follow. As Ezekiel stood there, watching the officers scramble to address the situation, he knew that this moment, though deeply personal, was about much more than himself. It was a reminder of the power of resilience, the importance of accountability, and the necessity of challenging a system that too often failed to uphold the values it claimed to represent. The video of the incident quickly made its way online. Shared by the bystander who had recorded it, the footage spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Viewers were struck by the stark disparity between Ezekiel Carter's calm demeanor and Officer Joseph Cooper's erratic behavior. People commented on the blatant abuse of power, the unnecessary aggression, and the disturbing act of burning Ezekiel's ID. Within hours, the video had been viewed by millions, sparking outrage and demands for accountability. News outlets picked up the story, featuring clips of the confrontation alongside discussions about systemic racism and police misconduct. Ezekiel, though initially reluctant to become the center of attention, realized the importance of using this moment to shed light on the broader issue. He agreed to speak publicly, addressing both the incident and the systemic failures it represented. Meanwhile, the backlash against Officer Cooper was swift. The police department issued a statement acknowledging the video and announcing an internal investigation. Cooper was placed on administrative leave as public pressure mounted. Protests were organized outside the department, with signs reading "Justice for Ezekiel" and "End Police Bias." Community leaders and activists called for Cooper's immediate termination and systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents. Cooper, once so confident in his authority, now found himself under intense scrutiny. Forced to face the consequences of his actions, he was required to attend a public apology and participate in mandatory training on racial bias. Standing in front of cameras, his voice faltered as he read a prepared statement. "I deeply regret my actions that day. My behavior was unacceptable, and I failed to uphold the standards of my position. I acknowledge the harm I've caused and commit to learning from this experience." Though his words were met with skepticism by many, the moment marked a significant shift in accountability. For Ezekiel, however, the apology was only a small step toward justice. Reflecting on the incident during an interview, Ezekiel shared his thoughts with measured candor. "This shouldn't have happened to me, or to anyone. It shouldn't take a title or fame to be treated with dignity and respect. That officer didn't see me as a person, he saw a stereotype. And while I was able to defend myself, there are so many others who don't get that chance. This isn't just about one bad officer or one bad day. It's about a system that needs to change, a society that needs to confront its own biases." Ezekiel's words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the nation. His story became a rallying cry for those who had experienced similar injustices, empowering individuals to speak out and demand change. But Ezekiel didn't stop there. He took the momentum from this moment and turned it into action. Speaking at youth groups, community events, and national forums, he used his platform to inspire others. In one of his speeches to a group of young activists, he said, "You are the future, and the future doesn't have to look like the past. When you speak up, when you stand together, you have the power to challenge the status quo and demand something better. Don't let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. It does." Ezekiel also launched a campaign focused on police accountability and racial bias training, partnering with organizations dedicated to reform. His work led to tangible changes in policy, including the implementation of body cameras and community oversight boards in his city. The impact of the incident was undeniable. What began as an act of injustice became a catalyst for meaningful change, proving that even in moments of adversity, resilience and action could prevail. Ezekiel's journey, though marked by pain and struggle, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that one person's strength could inspire a movement. Ezekiel's story reminds us that courage can inspire change. If this resonates with you, like the video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that matter. Together we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued. Please subscribe, click the notification bell to stay updated for daily stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this story impacted you. Thanks for watching.